Malcolm Drake built an empire without ever pulling a trigger. Reggie and Colin Burns ruled through terror, leaving blood on every street they touched. But behind them all was Elias Vane, the invisible hand that turned kings into pawns. In a city fueled by power, greed, and revenge, these men didn't just shape London's underworld, they tore it apart from the inside out. Malcolm Drake was never the kind of man who made noise. In the grey industrial sprawl of East London, where ambition often died in alleyways or prison cells, he rose not with bullets but with silence. He had worked at the docks for years, unloading crates, listening, watching. While others brawled and broke, he memorized supply routes, noticed where shipments came from, who handled them, and who skimmed from the top. Every man has a price, and Malcolm's gift was knowing exactly when to pay it, and when to let a man fall. His rise began when a trucking company on the edge of the Thames suddenly changed hands. No headlines followed, just a silent paperwork shuffle. Behind the scenes, Malcolm had leveraged a quiet debt, took over the business, and started routing product through it. Not drugs, yet. He began with counterfeit electronics and stolen goods. Enough to build capital, enough to buy silence. The crew he gathered was unlike the flashy street thugs dominating most of London's gang scene at the time. Malcolm found men others had discarded, ex-soldiers with no family, parolees who had outlived their usefulness in other crews, immigrants whose records had vanished in bureaucratic cracks. He didn't demand loyalty, he created dependence. They needed him to survive, and in return, they followed orders with machine precision. Malcolm's empire grew quietly. While other gangs battled over council estates and street corners, he bought into infrastructure. He took shares in private security firms, invested in scrapyards, bribed low-level councilmen. No one saw him coming because he wasn't where they expected him to be. By the time local authorities started asking questions, they found walls, silent employees, paperwork that checked out, businesses running just clean enough to avoid real scrutiny. But it wasn't just business. Malcolm understood the streets too. He knew violence was still currency, but he used it sparingly, almost clinically. One of his first and most important moves was the calculated elimination of a rival fixer named Doyle, a man known for erratic behavior and loose talk. Doyle disappeared one night after a meeting with Malcolm. His body was never found, and no one came forward to ask questions. That single vanishing cemented Malcolm's reputation more than 100 gunfights could have. Money flowed, Malcolm adapted. He began moving narcotics, but not the way others did. He cut deals directly with importers, skipping layers that usually soaked up profits and increased risk. He laundered money through car dealerships and property development firms. When one of his fake shell companies was raided in 2008, nothing connected back to him. The man listed as the CEO was found dead 3 days later of an apparent overdose. By 2010, the name Malcolm Drake had become a murmur in certain corners of the city. He wasn't feared in the traditional sense. He wasn't flashy or prone to theatrics. But he was everywhere, yet nowhere. Men who worked for him didn't even always know who they were working for. And those who crossed him found that things in their life simply stopped working. Visas revoked, accounts frozen, family members questioned by tax officers. The punishment was never loud, it was precise. While traditional gangs roared for attention, Malcolm built a fortress made of systems and silence. But as he grew, so did the tension around him. Old families who had ruled for decades began to notice their profits shrinking. Warehouses they thought were secure turned up empty, and soon the eyes of more violent men turned toward Malcolm Drake, not with curiosity, but with the kind of hatred born from fear. And in London, fear always leads to war. Reggie and Colin Burns were born into violence. Raised in a cramped flat above a betting shop in Camberwell, they learned early that fists spoke louder than words. Their father was a small-time enforcer with a reputation for brawling, but the brothers had ambition. far beyond pub fights and petty debts. By their early 20s, they'd taken over their father's turf, turning it into the foundation for something far more dangerous: the Ashgrove firm. Their power came from fear. Unlike Malcolm Drake's cold precision, the Burns brothers thrived on chaos. Reggie, the older one, was impulsive and brutal. Colin was quieter but more strategic, often cleaning up the messes his brother left behind. Together, they dominated South London. Heroin was their main currency, flooding estates from Lewisham to Clapham. They kept local dealers in line through ruthless tactics: knife attacks, fire bombings, public beatings. No one dared step out of line. By 2012, the Ashgrove firm was at its peak. The brothers had loyal crews in every corner of their territory, corrupt police in their pockets, and safe houses stocked with weapons. They were kings of their domain. But power breeds paranoia, and when Malcolm Drake's name started to surface more frequently, it sparked something dangerous in the Burns brothers. Drake wasn't playing the same game. He didn't recruit street kids or show off muscle, yet he was moving product through routes previously controlled by the firm. Trusted middlemen went missing or flipped allegiance without warning. Money started slipping away. It was as if their empire had a leak, and no matter how many heads they smashed, they couldn't plug it. Reggie wanted blood. He believed Malcolm Drake was weak, hiding behind accountants and contractors. In a rash move, he ordered a hit on one of Drake's key men, a logistics coordinator named Kevin Bristow. It was meant to send a message. Instead, it lit a fuse. Bristow survived the attack, but disappeared shortly after, likely pulled into hiding by Drake's network. Within days, 2 of the firm's stash houses were raided by anonymous tip-offs. A routine shipment from Rotterdam was intercepted and confiscated. Rumors swirled through the underground. Malcolm Drake was retaliating, not with guns, but with information. Colin saw the writing on the wall. He warned Reggie that this wasn't a street war. They were up against something far more calculated. But Reggie's pride was too wounded. He doubled down, convinced that force was the answer. He ordered a convoy of cars to intercept one of Drake's trucks near Bermondsey. But when they stopped it, the truck was empty. No drugs, no money. Just crates of office supplies and a tracking device wired to alert the police. The trap cost the Ashgrove firm 3 men and exposed their presence to law enforcement. It wasn't just a failed raid, it was humiliation. And it confirmed something Colin feared. They were being watched, manipulated. Behind closed doors, the brothers fought. Colin wanted to retreat, reorganize, figure out where the leaks were. Reggie wanted to escalate. He couldn't stomach the idea of someone like Malcolm Drake outplaying him. For the first time, cracks appeared in their once solid bond. The streets began to shift. Smaller gangs who had once feared the Burns brothers now considered switching sides. A few made quiet visits to East London. Unconfirmed sightings placed known Ashgrove members attending meetings in Drake-controlled areas. The Burns brothers had ruled with noise and terror for years. But now, the silence coming from the Iron Syndicate was louder and more terrifying than anything Reggie or Colin had ever faced. What they didn't know was that someone else had already begun playing both sides, feeding them lies and waiting for them to tear each other apart. Elias Vane didn't look like a criminal. Clean-cut, always in tailored suits, he moved through the city like a consultant or a government official. Most people never noticed him, and that's exactly how he liked it. Before anyone in the Underworld knew his name, he had already been studying them for years. Vane had once worked in financial compliance for an international bank. When he realized that criminals were earning more than he ever could legally, he didn't report them. He learned. From them, Vane built his influence slowly. He offered quiet services to gangs that were drowning in untraceable cash, money laundering, tax evasion structures, offshore account setups. He took a small cut and left no trail. But while Malcolm Drake and the Burns brothers built kingdoms, on muscle and territory, Vane built a web. And by 2015, he had threads connecting both. To Drake, He posed as a financial cleaner, someone who could make the books disappear when authorities came sniffing. To the Ashgrove firm, he claimed to be a new asset with links to international smuggling routes. Neither side suspected that he was working both angles. Elias wasn't chasing money or power in the traditional sense. He wanted control without exposure. He wanted to rule the game without ever being seen playing it. He began by sabotaging trust. Vane would leak false intelligence to one side while posing as the savior. He told Drake that the Burns brothers had planted a mole in one of his warehouses, which led to a violent purge that fractured Malcolm's internal network. At the same time, he fed Colin Burns doctored shipping manifests, suggesting that Drake's crew was planning a massive drug movement through Greenwich. The Ashgrove firm responded by launching a raid, only to find nothing. Each failure left them looking weaker and more unstable. The brilliance of Vane's plan was that he never lifted a finger. He let suspicion and ego do all the work. Both Malcolm and Colin were men who believed they were the smartest in the room. They couldn't accept that they were being manipulated, so they blamed each other, pushing their crews closer to open war. Vane also began targeting their money. He rerouted shipments, froze shadow accounts, and created phantom investments. One point, a warehouse owned by Drake's shell company was set on fire, a move orchestrated entirely through intermediaries Vane had recruited from neither gang. Insurance covered the loss, but the message was clear. Someone had found the cracks in the fortress. Meanwhile, Elias remained invisible. He didn't appear in photos. He never called directly. He used middlemen, encrypted channels, and one time, drop phones. His only vulnerability was his ambition. As the two empires weakened, he saw a future where their collapse would leave a vacuum he could fill. Not through blood, but through infrastructure, banks, ports, unions, and transport. He didn't want to be king of the streets.
He wanted to own the roads the kings marched on, but in creating chaos between the Burns brothers and Malcolm Drake, Elias Vane underestimated how much destruction desperate men could cause. His precision moves were becoming harder to control.
As emotions took over, the Burns firm was fracturing. Drake's inner circle was unraveling. Police presence was increasing. And in the background, smaller crews were circling like vultures. The web Vane had woven so tightly was now vibrating with tension. If one thread snapped, the whole system could collapse. He had set fire to the forest. Now, all that remained was to watch who burned first. What he didn't expect was that the fire would reach him too. It started with a phone call that never connected. Reggie Burns was scheduled to meet a supplier in a parking garage near Peckham. The deal was meant to be routine, money in exchange for high-grade heroin freshly arrived from Albania. But the moment his convoy arrived, something felt off. The supplier's car sat empty, engines still running. Before Reggie could react, masked gunmen emerged from the shadows and opened fire. By the time his crew fired back, it was already too late. Reggie lay dead beside the vehicle, his blood staining the concrete. The news spread fast. Within an hour, Colin Burns received the call. His brother, his partner, the face of the Ashgrove firm, was gone. The streets didn't mourn. In fact, for many, it felt like a signal. For Colin, it meant war. He didn't wait for proof or suspects. He named Malcolm Drake as the killer and unleashed the full fury of his network. Safe houses affiliated with the Iron Syndicate were set ablaze. Known associates were kidnapped, tortured, or left bleeding in alleyways. Drake's crew retaliated, but not with restraint. Entire blocks became battle zones. Firebombs lit up housing estates, and in one horrifying instance, a public bus was caught in the crossfire. News outlets swarmed the city, calling it the worst wave of gang violence London had seen in decades. Meanwhile, Elias Vane watched from a distance, unsettled. His plan had always involved chaos, but not this much. His careful manipulations were becoming irrelevant in a war driven by grief and rage. The power vacuum he had hoped to step into was now a crater of destruction. The Ashgrove firm was bleeding out. The Iron Syndicate was exposed, and law enforcement, long paid to look away, was now under pressure from every direction to act. The tipping point came when a warehouse in Shoreditch, believed to be one of Drake's main drug depots, exploded. In the middle of the night, the fire raged for hours. 3 bodies were recovered. Surveillance footage showed nothing useful. Rumors pointed in every direction, but the truth remained hidden. Elias Vane had been there hours earlier. Whether he set the charges himself or used a proxy, no one ever confirmed. What mattered was that Vane, who had spent years in shadows, had finally been seen. A single grainy CCTV frame caught him walking into the building, face partially obscured, but not enough to hide his identity from those who knew him. And suddenly, the silence that had protected him shattered. The next morning, Vane vanished. No calls, no sightings. His properties were found abandoned. The accounts he had used to shuffle millions were emptied or frozen. Some said he fled to Eastern Europe. Others believed Drake's men got to him first. The police launched a quiet investigation but turned up nothing. The ghost had disappeared. With Vane gone and Reggie dead, Colin had no anchor. His final act came in broad daylight, a reckless shootout with armed police after a failed escape attempt from a safe house in Croydon. He was arrested, badly wounded, and charged with multiple counts of conspiracy, weapons trafficking, and attempted murder. In court, he spoke only once, refusing to name names. He now sits in Belmarsh prison under maximum security. Malcolm Drake, for all his strategic brilliance, didn't survive much longer. Weakened by internal betrayal and hunted by both rivals and authorities, he vanished within months. Some say he died in a quiet house fire in Essex. Others think he faked his death and lives abroad. No body was ever found. London's criminal underworld collapsed inward. Smaller gangs fought for scraps, but none ever filled the void left behind. The era of the crime lords had ended not with arrests or redemption, but with fire, blood, and silence. And in the echoes of their downfall, the city still remembers.